At the end of the Second World War, the once thriving German aviation industry was in ruin. The previous 5 years had seen the idealistic dream of flight turn into a terrible wartime nightmare. From this destruction, German aviation has blossomed anew, and now, fully revitalized, it plays a vital part as a major contributor to European and global aerospace. Two massive corporations once dominated German aviation: MBB, Messerschmitt Bölkow Blohm, Germany's largest aerospace conglomerate, and Dornier, until its acquisition in the mid-1990s, the country's last major independent aircraft producer. These companies, which began at the very dawn of 20th century aviation, were established by two of history's true pioneers, Willy Messerschmitt and Claude Dornier. Of the two men, Claude Dornier's career was the longest, spanning the whole spectrum of aviation development from the airship to space exploration. Born in 1884, Dornier was a most reluctant genius. His first ambition was to be an architect. Dornier's school record was, however, undistinguished. Yet after leaving school, he enrolled at the Munich Technical University, where he gained an excellent engineering degree. It was on a trip to Lake Constance in 1910 that Dornier first saw Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin and his airships. Zeppelin had become a national hero in Germany, and despite many setbacks, was pioneering the development of lighter-than-air flight. Dornier, inspired by this charismatic figure, applied for a job. To his surprise, he was summoned to Friedrichshafen. At this time, many airships were being lost due to a new and mysterious problem: metal fatigue. Claude Dornier came up with a new type of metal flange that both reduced weight and added strength. It was this breakthrough that enabled much larger Zeppelins to be constructed, thus paving the way for both military and civil development. In the following years, the Zeppelin company grew from strength to strength, and regular passenger services were started to many European cities. New endurance records of up to 24 hours were set, and from 1910 to 1914, 35,000 passengers were carried on routes spanning thousands of miles. Dornier was soon promoted, and as head of the test department, he solved yet another crucial problem: that of handling an airship in strong ground winds. It was 1913 when Dornier came up with his unique design for rotating an airship hangar as it floated on a reservoir of water. Seeing the potential in his new protégé, Zeppelin gave Dornier his own airship design project. His machine, the Victoria Louise, incorporated many innovations in metal construction, and as the airship was moved out for its test flight, Dornier could only watch. After initial tests, the order was given for takeoff. With the full complement of passengers on board, the Victoria Louise's first test flight also proved a great success. This airship carried out many civilian trips before its final conversion to military use. The German people soon became captivated by these great airships, and many thousands would gather at Friedrichshafen to watch their departures. Amongst them was a young boy whose name was also to become synonymous with German aviation: Willy Messerschmitt. Born in Hamburg in 1898, Messerschmitt had always been fascinated by flight, and at the age of 11 was present at the first German air display where the Wright brothers' aircraft were being demonstrated. Inspired by these early pioneers, Messerschmitt soon began to construct his own model gliders, basing his ideas on Germany's earliest pioneer of flight, Otto Lilienthal. Lilienthal is the unsung hero of world aviation. His work provided the first practical evaluation of actual flight and was used extensively by the Wright brothers. Lilienthal believed that one could only get a proper insight into the practice of flying by actual flying experiments. In 1892, after many failures, Lilienthal launched himself into the history books with his first flight of 80 meters. After making many successful flights, he earned the reputation as the first man to fly a practical, heavier-than-air machine with any consistency. During the next 4 years, he fabricated numerous models which were sold all over the world and inspired many early aircraft designers. In 1896, during the flight trials of a new design, he crashed and was killed. His philosophy in work was to have a profound effect on the young Messerschmitt.
At the age of 15, he got associated with a man by the name of Hart. And Hart was building gliders in those days. This was the First World War, 1914-15 then, and Hart had become a soldier, but he sent postcards to young Willy Messerschmitt on how he should build these gliders, and so he did. So he got a very early and young involvement in aviation through this construction of gliders, and in fact, flying of gliders.
Claude Dornier was also turning his attention to fixed-wing aircraft, and in 1914, he began work on a large flying boat. Instead of using wood, cloth, and bracing wires, Dornier opted for a lightweight metal construction. And in 1913, the RSI was launched on Lake Constance. But it never flew. The night before the test flight, it was wrecked by a violent storm. Undeterred, Dornier constructed the RS-2, which made its first flight in 1916. The aircraft proved successful, and the RS-3 soon followed, containing the innovative tandem engine arrangement that was to feature largely in his later aircraft. During the final stages of World War I, Dornier also built a series of successful fighter aircraft, pioneering the use of lightweight alloy metals and modern production line techniques. But events were soon to overtake Dornier and Messerschmitt. With the armistice of 1918, aircraft production was halted. The subsequent Treaty of Versailles ordered the wholesale destruction of German aviation, and a ban on all future construction was imposed. Willy Messerschmitt escaped serious loss, since gliders were exempt from the ban. But Claude Dornier lost everything. His aircraft were broken up, his airships destroyed, his business ruined. The once busy Manzel plant on Lake Constance lay empty and derelict. Despite his seemingly hopeless situation, Dornier was determined to continue working and soon began designing aircraft from his home. In 1920, he produced a small flying boat, the Labella. To avoid the construction ban, he moved to a boatyard in Switzerland, and a year later, the Labella made its symbolic maiden flight over Lake Constance. But Dornier soon found the Swiss facilities too small, and with a larger project in mind, he bought a derelict shipyard at Marina di Pisa in Italy. Dornier threw his last hope into a large twin-engine flying boat. This unique aircraft, designated VAL, proved highly successful, so much so that the Spanish government ordered 6, even before flight trials were complete. It ensured Dornier's future. The VAL flying boat's robust construction and powerful engines made it popular with pilots. The first long-distance flights were attempted by the Spanish pilot Ramon Franco in 1924, but during his first attempt to cross the Atlantic, he was forced to ditch due to lack of fuel. After 8 days, the VAL was salvaged from the heavy seas, having sustained only slight damage. The crew's survival is a testament to Dornier's unique design. Throughout the 1920s, a series of highly publicized expeditions earned the Dornier Company international acclaim. The Swedish explorer Roald Amundsen used two VAL aircraft in a daring attempt to reach the North Pole, but after 9 hours flying, he was forced to make a landing on the pack ice to refuel. One of the flying boats was damaged beyond repair. With only limited food supplies, the crew worked desperately to clear a runway for takeoff. After 2 weeks, the overloaded VAL took off and managed to clear the pack ice. Landing in Spitsbergen several hours later, Amundsen declared that he owed his life to Dornier. A year later, a German pilot, Herr von Gronau, made a successful crossing of the Atlantic, landing in New York without incident. In 1925 alone, the VAL set 25 world records, including endurance, speed, altitude, and payload. With the growing demand in Europe for passenger transport, Dornier designed the land-based Mercury and Comet types. The latter proved particularly successful, and Air Lloyd, later to become Lufthansa, opened many new international routes using this aircraft. Dornier designs were now being sold all over the world. Dornier himself spent several months in Japan assisting their nascent aviation industry. In 1927, with the ban on aircraft construction in Germany lifted, Dornier moved back to Germany, reopening his old factory on Lake Constance. He soon began to develop one of the most remarkable aircraft of his career, the DO-X. After 3 years of planning and construction, the flying boat was launched on the 12th of June, 1929. With 3 decks and a wingspan of 157 feet, the DO-X was the heaviest aircraft of its day. 12 Bristol Jupiter engines, paired in 6 tandems, were needed to power the machine, and each one had to be run up and tested before takeoff. After some brief maneuvering, the order was given for takeoff. The aircraft lifted easily from the water into the air. It was one of the greatest moments of Claude Dornier's life. 318 flights proved the capabilities of the DO-X. On occasions, it carried up to 170 passengers. After a year of these flight trials, the DO-X took off for a world tour. Every kind of luxury was available on board, and Dornier himself was present for several sections of the trip. After crossing the South Atlantic to Brazil, the DO-X flew north and arrived in New York to a rapturous welcome. Thousands of people came out to watch this giant aircraft circle the city, and after a successful landing, Dornier was given a hero's welcome. On his return to Germany, Dornier found himself once again elevated to the status of a national hero. He had proved, despite his many critics, that an aircraft of this size could have an effective range and levels of safety and comfort hitherto undreamt of. The DO-X represented the first steps towards mass passenger transport. It stands as a landmark not just for German, but for world aviation. But by now, flying boats of this size were beyond the finances of Europe's rapidly collapsing economy. Dornier, along with other German aircraft companies, survived only through generous government subsidies. However, Dornier's Wall flying boats were still proving very successful, and Lufthansa began a regular transatlantic mail service to Brazil. 2 supply ships, the Bremen and the Westfalen, refueled the aircraft at sea and relaunched them by steam catapult to complete their flights. Despite the severest weather conditions, 400 of these pioneering crossings were made until 1939 without a single delay or accident. As well as upgrading his flying boat series, Dornier began work on a new land-based aircraft, and in 1931 he produced the advanced passenger transport, the DO-K. Its success gave Germany a high-performance airliner which could beat the competition from Europe and the USA. Dornier returned to flying boat design in the mid-30s and produced the DO-18. And after extensive testing, including severe sea trials, the DO-18 made a non-stop flight from the Azores to New York. The journey was completed in 22 hours and 12 minutes and marked the beginning of European transatlantic passenger service. The DO-24, which followed, was designed specifically to deal with the severe weather of tropical regions. It proved highly successful in the Far East and remained in service with the Spanish Air Force in an air-sea rescue role until 1969. The DO-26 was Dornier's last production flying boat, incorporating the very latest aerodynamic technology, and was built for transatlantic passenger service. It was also the first Dornier aircraft to carry the Nazi symbol. In the next few years, all Dornier aircraft were committed to military use, and Claude Dornier was to find himself part of a highly effective war machine. Throughout this period of Dornier's success, Messerschmitt still struggled for survival. During the First War, he continued to develop his gliders, and in 1922, he and his close collaborator, Friedrich Harth, started a small flying school. The special demands of glider design, low weight and drag combined with high strength and lift, led Messerschmitt to produce many new features, including the single-spar wing, which was to prove so significant in the success of his later powered aircraft. In 1923, Messerschmitt formed his own aircraft company, and after a slight relaxation of the Versailles Treaty, he produced a series of powered gliders, culminating in the successful M-17, a small two-seat machine. A year later, with a strong injection of capital, Messerschmitt set up a larger company, Messerschmitt Flugzeugbau. To meet the demands of the expanding German airlines, he produced the M-18, a single-engine monoplane carrying 10 passengers. Production was soon started, and the M-19 and the M-20 followed. With the global slump of 1929, demand for aircraft dried up. Unlike Dornier, Messerschmitt found no government subsidy, and in 1931, he went bankrupt. But political events were about to transform Messerschmitt's life. With the rise of Hitler in 1933, covert rearmament began, and huge amounts of cash were injected into the German aviation industry. At first, Messerschmitt undertook various small licensed contracts and continued to develop his gliders, which proved vital in the secret training of Luftwaffe pilots. But in 1934, a new order was placed, officially for a training aircraft. There can be little doubt, however, of the government's intentions to produce an advanced trainer for the Luftwaffe. For Messerschmitt, it provided a golden opportunity to incorporate a range of new designs, including a leading-edge slat, originally a Handley-Page patent, exchanged by Messerschmitt for the single-spar wing design. All-metal monocoque construction, flush riveting, and a fully retractable undercarriage made the Me-108 the most advanced aircraft of its time. After testing and some modification, the 108 went into full production. Its small 240 horsepower engine could manage 165 miles an hour, an excellent power-to-weight ratio and a tribute to Messerschmitt's background in glider design. The 108 became the standard trainer and communication aircraft during the whole of the war period. The design proved so durable that it went back into production in the 1960s and competed very favorably with contemporary designs. The Me-108 was also the forerunner of Germany's most famous fighter airplane. In 1934, the government had given several German aircraft companies the specifications for a fast monoplane fighter. Both Messerschmitt and Heinkel produced designs. Heinkel had unsuccessfully tried to buy out Messerschmitt's struggling company in 1932, and now he poured scorn on Messerschmitt's design. At the fly-off between the two prototypes in 1935, the Heinkel 112 broke the world speed record. 3 days later, Messerschmitt's design won it back.
The airplane was revolutionary by its very low weight and high power, again, like the earlier Messerschmitt philosophy, and also a good design for manufacturing, not with a very optimum aerodynamic shape, but with a good compromise to also allow mass production.
Some 35,000 Me-109s were eventually built in 100 different variants, more than any other combat aircraft. They formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter strength throughout the early conflicts of World War II, including the Battle of Britain. Although outclassed by the later years of the war, it remained in service both because of its ease of production and its devastating effects on daylight bomber raids, as this German newsreel shows. The success of the 109 made Messerschmitt Germany's leading aircraft designer. Called upon to make many propaganda films, he became as famous as the fighter ace Adolf Galland and others who flew the aircraft. Messerschmitt's next project, the Me-110, dated back to 1934, and a specification given to him for a new combat aircraft. Design work on a series of prototypes was begun, and on its first test flight, it reached a remarkable speed of 316 miles per hour. Tested in combat during the Battle for Poland, it proved a great success. Only when faced with the RAF did the 110 suddenly become a disaster. Outclassed by the Spitfire and Hurricane, it was soon necessary for 109s to escort the escort fighters. However, later in the war, it proved highly effective as a night fighter. A derivation of the Me-110, the 210, proved a failure for Messerschmitt. However, a new version, the Me-410, proved more successful and served as a destroyer and night fighter to the end of the war. One of the most remarkable of Messerschmitt's wartime aircraft was the giant glider, the Me-321. Following the success of airborne forces in 1940, the German High Command ordered the development of a large transport aircraft capable of invading Britain. Made of steel tubes, wood, and fabric, the 321 could carry 33 tons, enabling small tanks and motorized units to be transported. Highly vulnerable and difficult to fly due to its vast control surfaces, the Me-321 never proved an effective design. The 323, fitted with 4 and later 6 engines, did go into production, but many were lost in combat. Another large project was the Me-264. Capable of bombing the USA, it could have posed a serious threat to the Allies, but only one prototype had flown by 1945. In the later stages of the war, German industry used all kinds of forced labor, including concentration camp victims. Many thousands of these people were used in Messerschmitt's plant. Although not directly ordered by Messerschmitt, he was certainly aware of their suffering. Messerschmitt's link with the Nazis had always been close. He owed his very existence to the vast aircraft orders placed by the German military. Hitler himself became a regular visitor to Messerschmitt's plants. Claude Dornier's connection with the Nazis was more ambiguous. The Dornier Company had not been so dependent on military aircraft orders, and his personal attitude towards the Nazis is not recorded. Apart from the continuing success of his flying boats, Dornier produced only one key production aircraft series based on the Do-17. Unlike other German aircraft at the time, the Do-17 was originally intended as passenger transport, but Lufthansa rejected the machine because of its cramped cabin. However, its high speed and maneuverability made it an excellent military aircraft. The Luftwaffe placed large orders, and mass production began in 1937. Despite its success in the early months of the war, the Do-17 soon proved inadequately armed, and Dornier produced an improved version, the Do-215, with a larger cockpit for greater visibility and a position for a rear-facing gun under the nose. Dornier's pioneering spirit was also to produce one of the most advanced fighters to fly in the war. The Do-335 was conceived to meet the demands for a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor. Dornier went back to a patent of 1937 for a unique twin-engined arrangement, one pulling from the nose and one pushing from the tail. In 1939, extensive trials with models began, largely to determine the effect of engine weight in the tail. Because of the rear prop, a tricycle undercarriage was essential. The first test flight took place in 1941, with Dornier anxious to see the results of this radical new design. After initial trials, the aircraft reached a speed of nearly 480 miles per hour, faster than any other prop aircraft of the war. Full production was ordered, although of the 60 that were completed, only 20 reached combat units by 1945. But this was not the end of Claude Dornier's involvement with this aircraft. The last surviving example was taken to America in 1946, where it was placed in storage. Decades later, Dornier brought it back to Germany and began its restoration. Despite the difficulty of finding spares, Dornier's engineers managed to reassemble the aircraft and return it to its original condition. It now stands as the only existing example of a tandem prop aircraft of that era in the world. The demands of a desperate high command for a cheap, mass-produced, high-performance fighter gave rise to many innovative designs. One of the most remarkable was the Me-163, seen here on an early unpowered test. The Me-163 Comet was conceived by Dr. Alexander Lippisch, but production and later development was carried out by Messerschmitt. The aircraft was powered by one of the new generation of rocket engines. To reduce weight and drag, the Me-163 had no tail or undercarriage, taking off on a trolley, which was later jettisoned, and landing on a wooden skid. The first test flight took place in 1941, and after considerable development, it became operational in 1944. But the aircraft had its dangers. The volatile fuel could dissolve the flesh of pilots and ground crew in a matter of seconds. The high speed of over 600 miles an hour made it difficult to control, and its short endurance, less than 1 hour, limited its effectiveness. In the end, the 163's inherent dangers led to more aircraft being lost in accidents than were destroyed in combat. Despite its drawbacks, 370 Comets were produced and proved a serious threat to the Allies. Able to outperform any of their escort fighters, it caused heavy losses amongst U.S. daylight bomber raids. It remains to this day the only mass-produced rocket fighter in the world. But rocket power was soon to be surpassed by a new and rapidly developing power source, the jet engine. Messerschmitt's old rival, Ernst Heinkel, had designed and built the first jet aircraft, the He-178, in 1938. It had its first test flight on the 24th of August, 1939. As it lifted from the runway for the first time, few people realized that this small aircraft was to change the shape of world aviation. With the HE-178's success, the race was now on to develop the first production fighter. Heinkel, with a significant lead over his rivals, produced the HE-280, seen here undergoing gliding tests. After extensive trials, the first powered flight took place in August 1941. But Heinkel was not alone in the field. Willy Messerschmitt rapidly designed a new twin-engine jet aircraft. It was to prove to be the most effective fighter of the war. Messerschmitt's prototype had its first flight in 1942, and after modification was chosen in preference to the HE-280, which was soon scrapped. As with the HE-280, the 262 was powered by two Junkers turbojets. Despite their innovative design, they were prone to catch fire and were generally unreliable in the early versions. When the engines did work, the aircraft's performance was impressive. A rate of climb of 12,000 meters a minute and a speed of 470 miles per hour outclassed any Allied fighter. Crippled by fuel shortages and Hitler's insistence that it be used as a bomber, the 262 never lived up to its full potential. It represented both the height and, at the same time, the end of Willy Messerschmitt's career. In 1945, virtually all of Dornier and Messerschmitt's plants were destroyed. Both men were captured by the Allies and imprisoned for 2 years. The ban on aircraft production was imposed once again. German aviation lay buried beneath the rubble of its factories. But the reconstruction of this shattered country demanded engineers, and after their release in 1947, both men began to rebuild their companies. Dornier moved to a small factory and started to design and build weaving machines, a subsidiary which has survived to this day. Messerschmitt reopened the Augsburg plant and constructed prefabricated housing. Later, he designed a successful sewing machine, a 4-door car, and his famous 3-wheeled bubble car. But Messerschmitt wasn't satisfied.
Aviation was, of course, always on Willy's mind in those days where he was not permitted to do that in Germany. And in the early 50s, an opportunity was offered to do airplane design in Spain. Spain had been a licensee of Messerschmitt in the early 40s. In fact, the Messerschmitt 109 was built there under license construction. And the Spaniards wanted to do modifications of that airplane, including putting a British engine, a Rolls-Royce Merlin, in there instead of the Daimler-Benz engine, which was no longer available. But then the Spaniards also wanted some training airplanes, and Messerschmitt, together with the engineering team of that Spanish company, developed the first Spanish jet airplane, a little twin-jet trainer.
Claude Dornier was also forced to turn to Spain to continue his passion for aviation. In 1950, he established a technical office in Madrid, and with the help of a German and Spanish design team, he produced the DO-25, a short takeoff and landing, STOL, reconnaissance aircraft. The first test flight in 1954 proved a great success, and the Spanish government, echoing their earlier involvement with the VAL aircraft, placed a large order, once again ensuring Dornier's survival. In 1955, with the ban on aviation development lifted, Dornier returned to Munich to build the more advanced DO-27. Investing all his resources to begin production, Dornier counted heavily on winning a contract from the recently reformed Luftwaffe for a light trainer. After extensive evaluation of the aircraft, the DO-27 became the first German aircraft to be mass-produced since 1945. 10 years after its total destruction, Germany's aviation industry had been reborn. A larger addition to the STOL family, the Do-28, was launched in 1960 and proved as successful as its predecessor. Dornier, still the prime mover in the design program, celebrated his 70th birthday as Germany's leading aviation designer. A decade later, the last major development of the STOL family took to the air. The Sky Servant, Do-28D/Sky Servant. Larger than its predecessor, it soon proved a vital element in many Third World relief operations. The German armed forces also bought large numbers of the Sky Servant, which became a key transport aircraft. With the threat of a surprise attack from the east, the Luftwaffe asked for a whole range of quick-response aircraft. Dornier soon began work on a vertical takeoff and landing design. Referring back to a patent he originally made in 1924, he developed a small piston-engined, extreme short takeoff and landing aircraft designated the Do-29. Encouraged by the success of the Do-29, Dornier was keen to move on to a larger project. In 1962, the development of the Do-31, a large VTOL transport aircraft, was given the go-ahead. 2 years later, watched by Dornier and his wife, the test rig took to the skies. Some 200 successful test flights were made, and Dornier, although then in his 80s, vigorously pursued the development of a prototype. In 1967, the world's first and only VTOL jet transport took to the air. In nearly 500 flights, the validity of Dornier's VTOL concept was completely proven. Although the Do-31 never found a commercial market, it re-established German aviation's lead in technical innovation. While Dornier enjoyed success, Willy Messerschmitt struggled for survival. Despite a series of highly advanced designs, such as the X-1, a prototype VTOL fighter developed in 1962, his company survived only by building aircraft like the North American F-86 Sabre under license contracts with the USA. But things were soon to change.
Then came larger license manufacturing programs. The biggest one was the Lockheed Starfighter program, American license, and that really helped to rebuild the company in a fairly big scale, considering the post-war situation.
Messerschmitt's production soon began to expand. In 1955, he took over the Heinkel Company, writing the last chapter in their long rivalry. Other acquisitions followed, beginning a highly significant trend in European aviation.
That was the start of the big wave of subsequent mergers which took place simply because the number of projects which could be offered and which were available in the aviation business reduced. The designs were more far-reaching, while in the old days, about every year or two, a new design was done. Now a design was lasting for 10 or even 20 years. MBB, Messerschmitt Bölkow Blohm, was formed in 1969 to 1970 on that account.
MBB quickly became the largest aircraft manufacturer in Germany. Cooperation also became international. The Tranquil C-160, a large military transport aircraft, was made in cooperation with Aérospatiale, France. MBB held the major stake in the design work and constructed the hull of the fuselage. They also produced a helicopter, the BO-105, designed and produced exclusively in Germany and sold in both civil and military variants. In 1970, having seen his company rebuilt from nothing, Willy Messerschmitt felt able to retire. Claude Dornier never retired, staying with his company until his death in 1969. His spirit as a manager of people and designer of aircraft had molded his company for 60 years. The Dornier Company, now part of a larger European group, continues to contribute to advanced aircraft design. The Alpha Jet, an advanced trainer and light attack aircraft, is currently being flown by the German, French, and Belgian armed forces. In the late 1960s, NATO recognized the need to standardize its various aircraft types. MBB realized that European cooperation could challenge the USA's aircraft producers. That idea came to fruition with the Panavia Consortium, combining Germany, Italy, and the UK. This cooperative effort was to produce one of the most advanced combat aircraft of the modern era, the Tornado. Given its first test flight in 1974, the Tornado brought together all the best elements of previous attack aircraft. The Tornado's most recognizable feature is its variable sweep wing configuration, allowing for both supersonic flight and high maneuverability at low speeds. In 1980, the Tornado became the frontline strike aircraft of the British, Italian, and German air forces, beating off competition from the USA's F-16. German aerospace expertise, combined with European cooperation, had won the day. Both MBB and Dornier are now integrated into the Airbus Group ecosystem, a cornerstone of German and European aviation. Perhaps it is the traditions of both these pioneering companies that have ensured the current success and future of this giant conglomerate. Inspired by the success of the joint venture Tornado, in which the former MBB played a major role by building the central fuselage segment and assembling all the Tornadoes destined for the German Air Force, another milestone in European aviation was achieved. Airbus was originally conceived as a challenge to the USA's domination in the field of passenger aircraft. Development began in the 1970s with the A300, a mid-range, wide-bodied aircraft. Test flights proved successful, and large orders were placed. Construction of the Airbus takes place all over Europe, with German divisions building fuselage sections at the old MBB plant in Hamburg, and other key components at facilities tracing their lineage back to Dornier in Munich. Components for Airbus are transported around Europe by the Beluga, a modified A300-600, designed specifically to carry wing sections from the UK and to gather all the sections together for final assembly at the original Aérospatiale plant in Toulouse, France. The Airbus Consortium, in its 5 decades of existence, has grown in leaps and bounds. An entire family of Airbus aircraft is now produced. The larger A330/A340 series and the highly advanced fly-by-wire A320 now spearhead an entire range of aircraft already sold to some hundreds of operators worldwide. The A320, the world's fastest-selling airliner of its generation, has already celebrated over 35 years of service and has earned itself the reputation as a leading short to medium-haul aircraft among airlines and passengers. Its latest threat to U.S. domination of the industry at the time was the A3XX, a double-decker airliner which was currently well on the way to fruition. Its development was so far advanced that application had already been made to the airworthiness authorities for certification. This achievement followed several years of partnership between Airbus and a group of 20 key airlines in refining the A3XX design. European aerospace was, at the close of the century, seriously challenging the United States in a new, dangerous, but rewarding field: space.
In the space area, European collaboration also started in the 60s. And the most significant element is, of course, the autonomous launching capability through Ariane. And it's quite significant that Ariane has developed into a commercial venture also, not just a government-run venture. through the Arianespace company, in which MBB is also a partner among many other European companies.
Germany also contributed a large part to the Columbus project, a highly advanced space laboratory that would become part of the International Space Station. Going into operation at the turn of the century, it would collect all kinds of information to help humanity's understanding and future exploration of space. The company that had absorbed the traditions of the early German pioneers and set it firmly on the world stage of aviation continued to explore an ever-widening range of aerospace development. The Eurofighter, another collaborative project, designated the Typhoon, had already proved its potential performance against anything then on offer. This included new generations of helicopters, like the Eurocopter Tiger and the EC-135. The seeds sown by Germany's pioneers continued to grow and bear fruit. Throughout the destruction that had marked the darker side of German aviation, their desire to fly endured. Their dream continues to be fulfilled.
The German Messerschmitt Me-262. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, it was a quantum leap in fighter technology. For the Allies, the appearance of the new swept-wing fighter caused a great deal of anxiety and consternation. Nothing they had could come close to its awesome performance.
The top Allied fighter at the end of the war was the Spitfire Mark 14, with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. The Messerschmitt 262, which we captured and tested at Farnborough, had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. An advantage of almost 125 miles an hour, which means an aircraft with this performance, which is a quantum jump, can dictate terms of combat. It can initiate or finish combat as it wishes. It was a very formidable weapon indeed.
Considered by many to be the world's first jet fighter, it was in fact a distant second. Indeed, the first air-to-air kill credited to a jet fighter goes to the Gloucester Meteors of 616 Squadron RAF. On August 4, 1944, Flying Officer Dixie Dean, using the wingtip of his Meteor, toppled a V-1 flying bomb, sending it crashing into the ground. While the V-1 was a pilotless aircraft, it would still go down in history as the first jet versus jet encounter. It was a telling indictment. After a 21-month lead in jet fighter development, the Germans found themselves with just one design in production, the Me-262. By June 1944, only a handful were in service. But there was another jet fighter, one designed and built before the Me-262, the Heinkel HE-280. Designed by Ernst Heinkel, it was capable of over 500 miles per hour. At this late stage of the war, the HE-280 was nowhere to be seen. First flown in September of 1940, it was 2 years ahead of Willy Messerschmitt's Me-262. What happened? Was it simply indifference on the Luftwaffe's part, or was the promise of the HE-280 sabotaged by political interference, incompetence, or bitter personal rivalries? To find the answers, we must first look at the state of military aircraft design and production, beginning in the 1930s. Since the end of the First World War, aircraft engine horsepower steadily increased. At the beginning of the 1930s, new engine designs and the promise of the supercharger led to more and more horsepower. The new all-metal monocoque airplane revolutionized aircraft design. The possibilities seemed limitless. Speed, altitude, and range records were smashed. Military commanders saw great promise in these new designs, and as Europe crept toward war, orders for new bombers and fighters began to rise. With little time or money left for the development of any new or questionable propulsion systems, work focused on the evolution of the piston engine. Many engine builders called the idea of a jet engine the thing, technically unfathomable and little more than a pipe dream. But there were those whose pipe dreams would become reality. In 1930, Flying Officer Frank Whittle, RAF, applied for a patent for his jet engine. This was followed by Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain and his secret jet engine patent in 1935. Robert Pohl, a colleague of Ohain at the University of Göttingen, was instrumental in bringing Ohain's invention to the attention of leading German aircraft manufacturer Ernst Heinkel.
This man, Pohl was his name, he wrote to Heinkel, whom he knew. And he said, I have a man here who is into something which I think has a tremendous future to it. He is into jet propulsion. It's a continuous combustion engine. It draws air in the intake, compresses it, and then the combustion cans are sprayed with gasoline, and it turns a turbine wheel to keep the thing running, and the exhaust comes out the half end of it. As long as you give it fuel, it'll run forever. And he says, I have a man here who wrote a thesis about this sort of application for a jet engine. It pleased me very much if you would meet him and see him and talk to him about his ideas and his applications for future aircraft.
With Heinkel's backing, the German inventor created a line of experimental centrifugal flow jet engines, similar to Whittle's, each with ever more thrust. The entire program was conducted as a private venture and in the utmost secrecy. The German Air Ministry was kept in the dark. On the other hand, Heinkel was also unaware that BMW was working on their own jet engine. BMW's design was an axial flow unit, more complicated than the centrifugal design. It offered more power and greater efficiencies. It was also being developed with the full knowledge of the German Air Ministry. In time, axial flow designs would power Germany's fledgling jet force.
Early in the days immediately before the war, the Germans had become aware of the practicality of a jet-propelled engine as being pioneered by Frank Whittle. And at first, they followed the same concept as Whittle of centrifugal flow, which is the simplest form of jet engine, really, and also probably the most reliable. At that stage, certainly, in the pioneering efforts. But eventually, they turned quite rapidly after their first, if you like, experiments onto the axial flow type, which really offers many advantages. And they concentrated thereafter totally on axial flow engines. And within the limitations of the strategic materials they had, they were very successful in this. The only problem was that the axial flow engine is complex and therefore difficult to produce, time-consuming to produce. And also, unless you have the right strategic materials to contain the heat stresses, it can have a rather short productive life.
Work on a suitable test airframe for Heinkel's revolutionary new power plant was conducted at the same time. By August 1939, both engine and airframe were ready. Heinkel's HE-178 was no masterpiece. The short fuselage and stubby, elliptical wooden wings did not exude a sense of speed. On August 27th, test pilot Erich Varsitz settled himself into the cramped cockpit of the tiny aircraft. Watched by Ernst Heinkel and a small group of mechanics, the HE-178 began to roll. The takeoff run was short. Climbing to 500 meters, Varsit circled the airfield once and came in for a perfect landing. Total flight time, 7 minutes. History had been made. Wasting no time, Heinkel telephoned Ernst Udet, the chief of aircraft procurement and supply at the RLM, the Reich's Air Ministry. The response Heinkel received was far from enthusiastic. The world's first jet would have to wait. On September 1st, Germany plunges Europe into war. Long before 1939, the name Heinkel had become a household name in Germany. Indeed, Ernst Heinkel's Flugzeugwerk had gained a worldwide reputation despite considerable restrictions placed on German aviation by the Versailles Treaty of 1919. During the 1920s and 30s, Heinkel produced a number of new military types for countries like Sweden and Japan. With the rise of Hitler in 1933 and the expansion of the new Luftwaffe, the opportunities for Heinkel seemed endless. Orders for fighters and bombers began to pour in. While many of Heinkel's designs, like the HE-111 bomber, were very good, they lacked what he desired the most: speed. Heinkel was passionate about high-speed flight.
Well, Heinkel, he loved aircraft that flew fast. He wasn't all that into aircraft that were fighters, propeller-driven fighters and escorts and that sort of stuff, like the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was a man consumed by speed. The faster an aircraft knew, man, I'm for that.
Even before the first flight of the HE-178, he created the HE-176, the world's first rocket plane, in 1939. Unfortunately for Heinkel, official reaction was muted, and with the onset of war, all work on the project ceased.
Udet, Göring, and all those other people in the early Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium were propeller people. They believed airplanes that were driven by propellers and alternate engine systems. They said, no, an airplane flies best with propellers. And so Heinkel was looked upon as some kind of a crackpot. And the research he was doing on jet engines, they felt was just silly and waste of money. And so he never got any real support from the Nazi government.
Shortly after Hitler came to power, a new requirement for an ultra-modern single-seat monoplane fighter was issued. Heinkel's response was the HE-112, powered by a 695-horsepower Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Its direct competition was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 V1, also powered by the same Kestrel engine. The results were very close. While the Bf 109 was slightly faster, the HE-112 had a tighter turning circle and superior field performance. Amid general surprise and many raised eyebrows, Messerschmitt was awarded the new contract.
The Heinkel 112 was the better airplane as a combat airplane, and Rechlin test pilots endorsed that view entirely. So there was no doubt that from the pilot's point of view, Heinkel's 112 was number one.
For Heinkel, it was a bitter disappointment. It also marked the beginning of a new and rocky relationship between the aircraft manufacturer and the German Air Ministry. Undeterred, Heinkel continued with his quest for speed. Despite the lack of enthusiasm from Ernst Udet and later Erhard Milch, the State Secretary, Reich Air Ministry, Heinkel pressed on with his privately funded HE-280 twin-jet fighter. At the same time, the Messerschmitt Design Bureau completed a new twin-jet design study for the German Air Ministry. Submitted on June 7, 1939, the new proposal was accepted. On March 1, 1940, a contract for 3 airframes was awarded with the official designation ME-262. Simultaneously, and in the face of official apathy, Heinkel was rewarded with a similar contract. Even before the official contract had been signed, Heinkel had in fact cut metal on the first HE-280 prototype. The HE-280 was a quantum leap in aircraft design. Aside from the jet propulsion, the HE-280 was equipped with the world's first ejection seat and a tricycle landing gear. Prior to its first flight, a series of aerodynamic tests were conducted. Fitted with dummy engine nacelles, the prototype was towed into the air by an HE-111 and subjected to a number of gliding test runs. By March 30th, 1941, the HE-280 V1 was ready for its first flight. With just enough fuel for takeoff, the HE-280 lifted into the air. After a single low-altitude, low-speed circuit, the HE-280 made a safe landing. It was the world's first jet fighter, but the world didn't take notice.
The Heinkel 280 was a state-of-the-art machine which no one really appreciated.
Just as the Germans were developing their jet technology, the Allies had their own secret jet programs as well. In England, Frank Whittle, like Ernst Heinkel, was battling against the same government indifference. The new jets were not a high priority. Frank's persistence, however, finally paid off. On February 3, 1940, the British Air Ministry issued Britain's first jet aircraft contract. Gloucester's aircraft was selected to meet specification E-2839. Design of this new aircraft was a collaboration between Frank Whittle and Gloucester Aircraft. The new E-2839 was a low-winged monoplane with the engine mounted behind the cockpit and equipped with a tricycle undercarriage, just like the HE-280. Air for the engine was drawn in from the nose and passed through ducts on each side of the cockpit. Like the Heinkel HE-178, the Gloucester E-2839 was one of the world's first technology demonstrator aircraft. Its sole purpose was to flight test Whittle's W1 centrifugal jet engine, which developed a modest 860 pounds of thrust. A remarkable aircraft by any standard, 2 examples were built. On May 15, 1941, the first E-2839 took off from Cranwell Airfield at 7:45 p.m. The flight lasted just 17 minutes. The promise of Whittle's engine pushed the Air Ministry towards an operational jet fighter. Even before the first E-2839 took shape, specification F940 for a new jet fighter was finalized in December 1940. Because the new jet engine didn't have the required thrust, the new fighter would have to be a twin-engine design. The F940 was not a radical or advanced aerodynamic design. Following accepted aircraft practices, it was fairly conventional. On February 7, 1941, Gloucesters received an order for 12 Gloucester Whittle airplanes to the F940 specification. These would become the first Gloucester Meteors. Back in Germany, parallel work on the Me-262 was not proceeding smoothly. When the contract for the prototype had been issued, it was obvious to Messerschmitt that BMW had been unduly optimistic. The new BMW 003 axial flow engine was still unreliable, without sufficient power. It also had a substantially larger diameter. In order to accommodate the new larger engine, Messerschmitt had to completely redesign his original airframe. The new aircraft would be larger, with the engines housed in under-wing nacelles, just like the HE-280. While BMW struggled with their jet engine, the Junkers Aircraft Company was working on their own turbojet, the Jumo 004. This would provide a backup in case the BMW 003 failed. On November 1940, the Jumo 004 was bench tested for the first time. Major problems were revealed, and just as the HE-280 V1 made its first flight, Messerschmitt's first Me-262 V1 was fitted with a nose-mounted Junkers Jumo piston engine. It was not the start Willy Messerschmitt was hoping for. On April 5, 1941, the HE-280 was officially unveiled. To impress his guests, Heinkel arranged for a demonstration between a Focke-Wulf FW-198 and the HE-280. During the mock combat, the HE-280 completed 4 tight circles before the FW-190 completed 3. Finally, Ernst Udet showed some enthusiasm. Top speed was 485 miles per hour, 77 more than the FW-190. Impressed, the German Air Ministry sanctioned the manufacture of 13 HE-280A pre-production aircraft. Unfortunately for Heinkel, mass production of the HE-280 was still out of reach. Heinkel now found himself up against personal rivalries, duplication, and incompetent leadership. To understand this state of affairs, we have to return to the beginning of the new Luftwaffe. After Hitler took power, he appointed Hermann Göring as leader of the new Luftwaffe. A World War I ace and squadron commander, Göring soon gave a number of his ex-squadron mates titles in the newly formed Luftwaffe. Ernst Udet was one of the first. Many had no experience in aircraft production, or had any business background. By 1941, German aircraft manufacturing was in a crisis. Under the command of Ernst Udet, aircraft production had stalled. For the first year and a half of war, Germany was only producing 800 aircraft a month. It wasn't until after the Battle of Britain and the setbacks in Russia did the German High Command take action. Unfortunately for Udet, he was unable to effect any real change. In November 1941, he committed suicide. Udet's successor was Erhard Milch. Milch was an able, ruthless administrator, but he lacked the military expertise necessary for the job. Although he had good understanding of aircraft production, he was unimaginative and a conservative when it came to research and development. July 18, 1942. The first Me-262 is ready for its first flight. Unlike the HE-280, the Me-262 is a tail dragger. Because of the nose's high angle, most of the jet's thrust is wasted. After a problematic takeoff run, it takes to the air for a short 17-minute flight.
When the Messerschmitt 262 was first tested, it was a tail dragger. It had a tail wheel. And the only way you could get the thing up at level was for the pilot to put on the brakes, and so the aircraft would come up level, and then they could take off with it.
Across the Atlantic, America finally enters the jet age with the first flight of the Bell P-59A. The date is October 1st, 1942. By the summer of 1942, the HE-280 was still very much in the picture. In June, the HE-280 V2 prototype was re-engined with two Jumo 004A engines, each rated at 1,852 pounds of thrust. Now, for the first time, both the HE-280 and the Me-262 are equipped with the same type of engine. Flight trials proved promising, with a top speed of 491 miles an hour being reached. A true comparison of the two fighters could now be made. Flight testing of the fourth Me-262 prototype showed that with the same power plants, it enjoyed a marked performance advantage over the HE-280. Compared to the straight-wing HE-280, the Me-262 looked faster. Its shark-like appearance and swept-back wings gave it a menacing presence. Even with this apparent advantage, the Me-262 still had a long way to go. For Heinkel and Messerschmitt, the road ahead was not a simple one. Both had suffered serious setbacks, their reputations now in question. In Messerschmitt's case, his new Me-210 twin-engine fighter was a complete failure. For Heinkel, the intractable problems associated with the disastrous HE-177 heavy bomber was a major distraction. By the summer of 1942, Germany was still victorious. After some unexpected setbacks in Russia, they were once again on the offensive. In North Africa, the First Battle of El Alamein began with Erwin Rommel leading the way. From a military perspective, Germany was at the height of its power, but it was now fighting on three fronts. Losses would be heavy. In September, the Battle of Stalingrad began with much promise. It was a bloody battle of attrition, and one in which Germans were losing. On November 1st, Allied troops break out of El Alamein. 7 days later, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops invade North Africa, with American and British troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's fabled Africa Corps is now being squeezed on two sides. November 19th. Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. Its aim, surround the city of Stalingrad and annihilate all German forces. The Soviet offensive is a spectacular success, and by the end of January 1943, the battle is all but over. The German Sixth Army surrenders. It was the first Nazi acknowledgement of failure. In May, the battle for Tunisia is over. German and Italian forces surrender, with 250,000 troops taken prisoner. These military losses represented a key turning point. Germany was now on the defensive. For the Luftwaffe, January 1st, 1943 represented a time of crisis. Its operational strength had sunk to some 4,000 aircraft. It had also failed to introduce new, more modern types, aircraft like the HE-280 and the Me-262. In fact, the Luftwaffe was drawing on its last accumulated reserves. Contingency plans were non-existent. Any new military setback would be catastrophic. The German High Command had resolutely declined the possibility of waging a defensive war. From Hitler on down, the mantra had always been attack. The losses in Stalingrad and North Africa put a severe strain on Luftwaffe resources. For the first time, serious cracks began to show. But it wasn't just the losses in North Africa and Stalingrad that hobbled the once mighty Luftwaffe. The pre-war belief that Germany's military conquests would be short led to short-term planning. New modern aircraft wouldn't be needed. It was a strategic miscalculation, and one that had a direct effect on the development of Heinkel's HE-280 and Messerschmitt's Me-262.
Heinkel was up against the German Air Ministry, even though he had Ernst Udet as his very good friend and confidant. The German Air Ministry, they wanted a flying machine powered with like the Focke-Wulf 190, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, that were designed for ground support, like in Poland and elsewhere.
For Heinkel, the battle for the HE-280 continued. As Germany's fortunes began to change, many still clung to the belief in a rapid victory, even in the second half of 1942. Erhard Milch was one of them. After Udet's suicide, he did manage to increase aircraft production, but at a cost. To avoid Hitler's wrath, Milch was unwilling to add any new types to the assembly lines. Doing so would cause monthly production numbers to fall. As a result, most of the pre-war designs remained in production right until the end of the war. Unfortunately for Heinkel and Messerschmitt, Milch's aversion to risk continued to have its effect in the one field where Germany could establish technical superiority: jet planes. In September 1942, both Erhard Milch and the German Air Ministry agreed. Any preparations for series production of the Me-262 would be premature, and in view of Heinkel's numerous commitments, production of the HE-280 was unrealistic as well. It was a curious point of view, but in early 1943, that all changed. In January 1943, Heinkel's HE-280 V6 prototype, powered by two Jumo 004 engines, took flight. For the first time, Heinkel pitched this version as a fighter bomber. In a complete about-face, the German Air Ministry changed its mind and began negotiations for the manufacture of 300 280s. It now seemed as if the 280 would finally see mass production and enter service before the Me-262. Ironically, the 262 V4 prototype, powered by the same Jumo 004 engines as Heinkel's new jet bomber, enjoyed a marked performance advantage over its rival. While the HE-280 was thought to be faster with a better rate of climb and ceiling, it only had 2/3 the range. In the end, the 262 was the superior fighter. In a letter dated March 27, 1943, Milch wrote to Heinkel, ending the 280 project. In Milch's letter, he claimed that the overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. For Heinkel, it was a bitter defeat. In a conference shortly after, Heinkel observed that Milch and his colleagues had a noticeable sense of unease about the jet, and the talk was always about jet bombers. For Willy Messerschmitt, victory over Heinkel would prove a Pyrrhic victory. Meanwhile in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor prototype DG-206 made its first flight. Like the Germans, British officialdom and industry were slow to deliver a reliable jet engine. Official confidence was shaken when the impellers on Whittle's W2B engine continually burst at high speed. This was eventually remedied with imported impellers from General Electric, who in 1941 built their own jet engines based on Whittle's design. Fortunately for the program, Rolls-Royce was called upon to take over development and production of the W2B engine. Back in Germany, development of the Me-262 continued. Compared to the British, the German program was disorganized, inefficient, and veiled in secrecy, even from those who should have known. Surprisingly, Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was kept in the dark. Not until May 22, 1943, did he fly the fourth 262 prototype. Galland was so impressed that he recommended production of the Bf-109 be halted and changed to the new jet fighter. Galland's enthusiasm swept away any remaining hesitancy and vacillation. 72 hours later, Erhard Milch ordered the 262 into series production. But many questions remained. Why did those involved in the program not see the value of the 262 sooner and act before Galland's endorsement? Why was it kept secret from Galland? And why didn't he fly the HE-280? One can only speculate as to what might have been if just 2 years earlier he had flown the 280. Finally, Messerschmitt had what he wanted, but there was one man who didn't agree. Adolf Hitler rejected out of hand any mass production of the Me-262. Said Hitler, "Nothing will be done with the new jet until I have decided on its merits." Unfortunately for Messerschmitt, the Führer was increasingly obsessed with revenge and retribution. Striking back at the enemy was far more important than providing his fighter arm with a fighter capable of defending the Reich. This would lead directly to Germany's third jet-powered aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb. Powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile and the first jet-powered aircraft to see combat in World War II. Shortly after D-Day, the V-1 bombardment of London began. To help counter the threat, the RAF deployed the first jet fighter, the Meteor Mark I. Compared to the HE-280 and the Me-262, the Meteor was slower. But more importantly, it was a combat-ready machine powered by centrifugal jet engines. Though the German axial flow engine offered more punch, Frank Whittle, the genius behind Britain's early jet engines, was sold on the reliability of centrifugal design.
Now, axial flow engines are much more complex than centrifugal, but much more efficient. Ideally, one should have headed for axial flow. But one has to put oneself back a bit in time and remember where we stood in the history of jet development, and that was not very far along the road. Whittle, quite rightly, when I talked to him, he knew all about axial flow, but I said to him, "Why have you gone this way, Frank, into centrifugal?" And he said, "Because in this present state of the art, I am looking for reliability and simplicity."
In November 1943, Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. Hitler scolded those in attendance, asking why, after years of demanding a fast bomber, was he presented with a fighter? Hitler wanted to know if the jet aircraft could carry bombs. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative. For Hitler, the matter was settled. The Me-262 would be produced as a Blitz bomber. In fact, Messerschmitt disobeyed Hitler and continued to develop his jet solely as a fighter. 6 months later, when Hitler found out, he flew into an incandescent rage. On May 25, 1944, he ordered all 262s to be built as bombers. It was a major blow and added more technical problems to an already troubled program. One of the biggest and ongoing hurdles was the development of the Jumo 004 engine into a reliable power plant. The Jumo 004 was an axial flow compressor design. In theory, it offered more power over the higher drag centrifugal compressor engines used by the British. In practice, however, the Jumo engines were considerably inferior. The shortage of strategic materials like chrome and nickel led to the failure of many substandard turbine blades at high temperatures. The Jumo 004 also suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. The Jumo 004 was a technical and operational failure. Not only did the Jumo 004 have a very short lifespan, it was unreliable, prone to surges, stalls, and fires. This was the Me-262's Achilles heel, one Allied pilots would feast on.
The engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, the designers hadn't thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the 262s they picked off was usually in that phase of the operation.
By July 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. While the Me-262 was in production, the numbers in operational service were meager at best, and would remain so until the end of the war. The first American B-17 shot down didn't occur until August 15th. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Shut out since the rejection of the HE-280, Ernst Heinkel was finally brought back into the jet fold. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. For Heinkel, it was a question of pride. Eager to prove himself once more, he accepted the challenge. Heinkel quickly realized that in order for the jet to work, the engine had to be mounted just above the fuselage, similar to the V-1. 12 days after the specification had been issued, the HE-162 mock-up was ready. On September 23, 1944, Heinkel's HE-162 was selected for mass production. Captain Eric Brown recalls demonstrating the HE-162 to Heinkel in a post-war test flight.
He was like a schoolboy jumping up and down with delight, and asked very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. He had heard about the disaster we'd had with it. I found him with a very acute mind and struck me as a highly intelligent person.
By late 1944, the German High Command was fueled by fear, fantasy, and pathological denial. Galland said that the HE-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler youth was beyond reality. Even at this late stage of the war, Heinkel was working on at least 26 different versions. Using slave labor, 100 aircraft were produced in February of 1945. On February 6th, the first group converted to the new type. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. The new jet and rocket fighters introduced late in the war had no impact on the outcome. Many have argued that if the HE-280 had been produced sooner, history would have been different. Perhaps, but in the final analysis, the 280 wouldn't have made a dramatic difference. For Ernst Heinkel, there was a deep bitterness. His early groundbreaking developments were essentially ignored. As to who actually killed the world's first jet fighter, the answer is many. The HE-280 was quite simply a victim of mismanagement and industrial chaos. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Göring, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Instead of a uniform, consistent policy towards aircraft production, confusion and chaos reigned.
Göring must hugely accept blame for a lot of the failings of the Luftwaffe, particularly the delay and the mismanaging getting aircraft into production. And to a large extent, Udet was one of his causes of his problem. Udet was an extroverted, magnificent exhibition pilot in civil life. And he had been in Göring's squadron in World War I. Ernst Udet had no interest in politics, and Göring approached him as an old squadron mate and said, you know, the Nazi party needs you and your experience. Come in and be the head of our technical department. Udet was talked into this and was completely out of his depth.
Firms like Heinkel and Messerschmitt tried to build everything from trainers to strategic bombers. Every effort made by the Air Ministry to move them towards any specialization was effectively countered. Clear-cut technical objectives were never issued. Programs were allowed to continue regardless of the enormous waste in time, skill, and materials. Overall, the Nazi management of the aircraft industry was uncoordinated, inefficient, plagued by ignorance and incompetence. Even if the HE-280 had become operational in 1942, its overall effectiveness would have been limited. It all came down to the Jumo 004 power plant. Unreliable with a critically short lifespan, it was not ready for combat operations. Serviceability rates would have been low, as was the case with the Me-262. Finding good pilots would have been another issue. The number of newly trained pilots could barely keep pace with attrition. Fuel shortages also began to take hold. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was a dying force with no chance of recovery. As the world's first jet fighter, Heinkel's HE-280 was a marvel of technology and inspiration. Unfortunately for Heinkel, those in power saw little use for his twin-jet fighter. Hitler's reluctance to produce jets almost certainly doomed what little hope Germany had of ever producing an effective jet fighter force. As the Allies sifted through the spoils of their victory, the incredible technology left behind, they counted themselves lucky that Germany had recognized the potential of jet power too late.
The jets were left absolutely untouched. Now, I was puzzled about this, frankly. What had motivated this? It certainly wasn't because it was overrun too quickly for them to have got rid of these jet aircraft. I think, deep down, it was a sense of pride of what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted us to see it.